Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me here on the Royal House of Ra. I am your host, Ramses Khufu El Ra, which I had mentioned to you in the last episode, which was on Monday, episode 21, in which I mentioned that I was going to change my name from Amenhotep to Ramses to honor my ancestor Ramesses III of the 20th Dynasty. Today's episode 22, we'll be discussing the last dynasty of the New Kingdom era, which is the 20th Dynasty. Now, this dynasty particular is a dynasty that I am a descendant of. I have DNA evidence to prove that of my descendancy to this dynasty, which I am a descendant of Ramses III, who was the second pharaoh of this dynasty. Now, that also would also mean that I'm also related to his father Setnakte and to his son Ramses IV and other members, but I have the DNA evidence showing, and if you look at episode 1, I present those DNA evidence to prove my descendancy to Ramses III. So what we're going to talk about is the pharaohs of this last great dynasty of the New Kingdom period. And this, as I mentioned before, as I mentioned it from the other dynasties, from Dynasty 18 to 19, and now I'm mentioning again with the last dynasty, Dynasty 20. This dynasty, not just this dynasty, but this dynasty was the last dynasty, and this was the dynasty that pretty much maintained Kemets' boundaries and sovereignty from foreign invaders, because this was the time where Kemet was really being tested at this time, and you had invaders like the Libyans who came from the west to invade, and Ramses III was able to defeat them, and then you had the sea people who came to invade, and he crushed them as well. Now, before the wars had started, Kemets' economy was very strong and stable. Had a strong centralized government. Great works was being done here. But when these invasions starts, like any war is very expensive. You have to pay for military material, pay for the soldiers, and etc. Whatever's needed for the war effort. Now, when you have an invading armies coming in, that exhausts your economy, and it also exhausts your resources, because you have to put a lot of resources into military campaigns of that sort. So after Ramses III was able to defeat these foes, it really hurt the economy, and this is pretty much during the almost close to the last years of his reign. It was hard for him to recover the economy from there. But the Kemet did not collapse. It was still a great nation, an empire nation under his descendants like Ramses IV. They think all the Ramses that came after him, they were weak. No, not all of them were. A lot of them were able to maintain the empire. But after the last pharaoh of this dynasty, Ramses XI, and then we moved in, once the end of the New Kingdom had happened, after the last pharaoh reigned from the New Kingdom, which was Ramses XI, as I mentioned, then we went into the age of collapse, the weakening of the central power and Kemets' power and dominion throughout the world. This happened with the priesthood. The priesthood ruled right after the 20th dynasty. And when the priesthood ruled, it divided Kemet from two ruling factors. You had the priesthood, and then you had Dynasty 21. Okay, so but we will go into that. So, but what we're going to do is part 1 of Dynasty 21 of episode 22. We're going to do part 1, which we will discuss the first 5 pharaohs of the 20th dynasty. So, further ado, let's conduct the show here. And before I conduct the show, let me just mention this before I move forward with that. I'd like to give a thanks to those who support the Royal House of Ra channel. Please continue to do so. Please share the content. Please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification button so you know when new shows will air. And also, please hit that like button, because that by hitting the like button, you help out our show here on YouTube. So thank you once again for your support. So now let's get into the show here. Now, the 20th dynasty ruled Kemet from 1185 to 1070 BC. Now, the first pharaoh, you have the first 2 pharaohs I'm going to talk about, and then I'll talk about the other 3, and then we'll end it from here. The first pharaoh was Setnakte. He reigned Kemet in 1185 to 1182 BC. And then the second pharaoh of the 20th dynasty was Ramesses III, who reigned from 1182 to 1151 BC. And I want to say this: I'm proud to be a descendant of Ramses III, and I am proud to maintain that Kemetic knowledge and heritage. All right, so let's begin with the show here. We're going to start with Setnakte, who was the first pharaoh of this dynasty, of Dynasty 20. The 19th dynasty had ended with a degree of confusion, not least with the presence of Tiwazret as queen regnant, only the 4th in Kemets history to that date. Whether there was a short period of anarchy, perhaps of only a few months between the end of Tiwazret's sole reign and the accession of her successor, Setnakte, is debatable. How Setnakte came to the throne, or indeed who he was, is uncertain. The best source for the beginning of the 20th dynasty comes from about 65 years later in the account in the Great Harris Papyrus. The last 4 pages describe how Setnakte arose and put down the rebellions fomented by Asiatics. He relieved besieged cities, brought back those who had gone into hiding, and reopened the temples and restored their revenues. Setnakte reigned for only about 3 years. His son, the future Ramses III, by his wife Queen Tea, Merenesis, was apparently associated with him in a short co-regency. Setnakte was buried with full royal honors described in the papyrus. He was rolled in his king's barge upon the river, crossed the Nile to the west bank, and rested in his eternal house west of Thebes. Setnakte actually usurped and enlarged Queen Tezret tomb KV 14, which had already been taken over from Seti II. He had begun to excavate another tomb, KV 11, but this had intruded upon the tomb of Ramesses KV 10 and been abandoned. Subsequently, it was to be realigned and used by his son Ramesses III. Setnakte coffin was found in the royal cache in Amenhotep II's tomb, KV 35, in 1898, and it is possible that his may be the unwrapped and unidentified body found on a wooden boat in the tomb. Okay, so with the first pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, there wasn't too much of a history where he had came from and where his foundings were. Most likely where his parentage and stuff like that. He reigned after the last ruler of the 19th dynasty, which was Queen Tezret, and during his first 3 years of his reign, he had to fight Asiatics. So Asiatics started to become a problem during his reign, and then they became a problem in his son's reign. So let's go into Ramesses III, my ancestor. Ramesses III was the last of the great pharaohs of the throne of Kemet. He ruled at a time when the outside world of the Mediterranean was in turmoil. It saw the Trojan War, the fall of Mycenae, and a great surge of displaced people seeking new homes. A tidal wave that was to break upon the shores of Kemet during his reign. The first 4 years of Ramses' reign seem to have been quiet ones. He no doubt sought to consolidate his position and continue his father Setnakte's efforts to stabilize the country. There were no problems in the south, in Nubia, since that had now more or less achieved the status of a subdued colony. The first sign of trouble came in year 5 with an attack from the west. The Libyans, coupled with 2 other tribes, the Meshesh and the Sepet, endeavored to force their way out of their deserts into the fertile lands of the western delta. The Kemets army was more than a match for them, and they were annihilated, those not slain becoming slaves in Kemet. For a while, the states bordering Kemet had learnt their lesson not to meddle with Pharaoh. In year 8, the bubbling cauldron of the Middle East boiled over, no doubt, exuberated by several bad harvest years, as well as the general upset of nomads trying to settle. As the great Harris Papyrus records, the foreign countries plotted on their islands, and the people were dislodged and scattered by battle or at one time, and no land could stand before their arms. This was not a small skirmish, but a major folk movement by people sufficiently desperate and well armed to be able to destroy Kemets' age-old enemy, the Hittite Empire. This mass of people was in fact a confederation of which the names are listed: the Peleset, Philistines, T. possibly connected with the Tiruskre of the Tirol, the Sketkelish, possibly Skelets from Sicily, Weshesh of uncertain origin, and the Dinian or Dardani, who could be the Danieli of Homer's Iliad. Together, the confederation made up the Sea peoples. Ramesses III and the Sea peoples. The written and graphically illustrated account of Ramses' fight against the Sea peoples is recorded on the walls of his great and remarkably well-preserved mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The written account occurs on the outer wall of the second pylon, north side. It is the largest hieroglyphics or metaneta inscriptions known. The graphic representations are carved on the outer north wall of the temple. Now, see, you had a confederation of these people. As it mentioned before, during this period, there was what I would call the tribulation period, where in the Mediterranean there was a lot of upheavals that was going on. There was wars, there was empires being conquered, civilizations collapsing. These people who are from these civilizations became nomadic, and they spread around to look for land where it was fertile land where they can eat. There was drought going on. There was a lot of upheaval going on at this time. So these people had created a confederation to have a joint collaboration for their survival. So they went around destroying other nations, and Kemet was on the radar. And this is what Ramses III had to deal with, and he dealt with it swiftly and ruthlessly. Okay, having halted for a while in Syria, the Sea peoples resumed their march overland to attack Kemet. This was not simply an act of war, it was with intent to force their way into Kemet and settle. They were a nation on the move, complete with women and children and family possessions piled high on ox carts. At sea, their fleet of no mean proportions kept stationed with the march. Ramses realized that rapid movement was called for. Dispatches were sent to the eastern frontier posts to stand firm at all costs until the main Kemetan army could be brought up. The clash came at the border, and the slaughter of the invaders was great as the reliefs depleted. Pharaoh was everywhere in his chariot, and according to the canon of Kemetan art, represented at far greater size than any of the other participants. Although the land invasion had been scattered, there was still the threat from the sea. The Sea people's fleet made for the mouth of one of the eastern arms of the Nile, to be met there by the Kemetan fleet. What transpired is rather interesting because the Kemetans had never prided themselves on being great sailors. They hated the sea, Wadet, the Great Green, as they called the Mediterranean, but here they were fighting what was virtually a landlocked battle. Ramses had ranks of archers lining the shore who poured volley after a volley into the enemy ships as soon as they were within range. Kemetian marine archers are shown calmly standing on the decks, firing in unison, the enemy ships being hauled alongside with grappling hooks. The enemy dead fall before the onslaught in contorted postures, and Ramses returned victorious by the grace of Amun, the god of thieves. This was really the beginning of the buildup of the fabulous wealth of the priesthood of Amun that was to have such disastrous consequences in the next dynasty. Okay, so this is, as I mentioned earlier before beginning the show, right after the 20th dynasty. This is at this time the priesthood at Thebes was starting to build their power, slowly building their power. And by the end of the 20th dynasty, they built their power, and then they became their own political entity within Kemet. Now, when you have a priesthood, if you so any place that's ruled by a religious order cannot maintain itself to a certain degree. So we'll have a discussion on that when we get to Dynasty, the priesthood, and Dynasty 21. Okay, now although now follow-up campaign to pursue the sea peoples back into the Levant is recorded in the Great Harpers, or on the walls of Mentenet Habu. Such a move would have been reasonable. It is interesting to note that the great entrance gateway to the temple is actually modeled on a Syrian fortified tower, a migdal, such as are clearly seen on the reliefs of Seti I and Ramses II at Karnak. Ramses III building was merely an ornament, an ancient Kemetian folly in a way, but he did have a use for it because on the walls of some of the upper rooms are scenes of him dolling with the ladies of his harem. The further campaigns of Ramses III. For 3 years, Kemet was quiet. Then came trouble on the western borders, again with the Libyans, allied with the Meshwesh and 5 other tribes. There had been a slight infiltration by immigrants into the area west of the Canabic arm of the Nile for some years, but in year 11 it came to a head with an invasion. The frontier forts took the brunt of it as the invaders attempted to overrun the delta. Once more, Ramses crushed all opposition. The attackers left over 2,000 dead, and their cattle and possessions were rich booty for the treasury of Amun. The campaign details occurred on the inner wall north side of the first Payan at Medinet Habu. At one point, army scribes come before Pharaoh with a tally of the enemy dead, represented by a pile of severed right hands, and the number above them 175. Ramses seems to have questioned the figure. The scribes had to recheck. The next register explained how they did it by cutting off the phallus of the uncircumcised enemy shown piled on the ground with the number above them, 175. The numbers tallied, the accountants are always right. Other campaigns are mentioned in the inscriptions in the mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Some of the scenes, however, are suspect. Okay, so once again, Kemet went under a peaceful period. Then the Libyans and other tribes that came from the west tried to invade Kemet again, failed miserably, and my great ancestor Ramses III was able to repel these enemies of Kemet. Ramses is depicted in a Nubian campaign which finds no other mention and would be highly unlikely in view of the subordination of that area. Other scenes show the king invading territories to the north, going into the country of the Amoru, Kati, and Syrians, none of whom existed any longer as political entities. These reliefs seem, in fact, to be copies of earlier ones from a building of Ramses II. Ramses III is merely modeling himself on his illustrious predecessor, who, despite their proximity in numerical sequence, was unrelated to him. The royal family. Despite the length of Ramses' reign, 31 years and 41 days according to the great Harpers, little is known about the ladies of the court and the royal children. Ramses' chief queen seems to have been named Isis, but for some curious reason, the cartouche in the Medinet Habu temple, where the queen's name would normally appear, have been left blank. Possibly Isis was of Asiatic extraction, since her mother's name was Habadalet, a distinctively un-Kemet name. Queen Isis had her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, QV 51, and was the mother of Ramses IV. Ramses VI, correction. Ramses III not only had several wives, but also a number of sons, probably at least 10, many of whom predeceased him, as is revealed by the number of their tombs in the Valley of the Queens. Notable amongst the tombs for their preservation and brightly colored wall paintings are those of Amen Herc, I'm going to try to pronounce this name, Amen Herc Hope Chefs, QV 55, and Kam Wazet, QV 44. Also laid to rest in the valley are the princes Parahara Nameth, QV 42, and Seth Herakhtepseth, QV 43. All four sons held office under their father, concerned with the royal horses or charity. There are several other unnamed tombs of princes and princesses in the area, a number of which appear to date from Ramses III's reign and may belong to some of his other children. One of the larger tombs, that of Queen Titi, QV 52, lacks any proper indication of her royal status, but an analysis of her titles suggests that she was possibly a daughter and subsequently wife of Ramses III, who outlived him. No less than 43 times does her title as mistress of two lands appear. She is called chief royal wife 33 times, king's daughter, king's beloved daughter of his body, and his beloved daughter 20 times, king's sister 4 times, but more importantly, king's mother 8 times. Her son could possibly be Ramesses IV. The majority of the tomb in the Valley of the Queens, including the finest, that of Ramses II, Queen Nefertiti, were found by the Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli in 1903 and 1904. The conspiracy to kill the king. Now, there was a conspiracy within his harem. This was a conspiracy of power play to position 2 of his sons, and we're going to go into that and explain what was going on in that period. This was considered a scandal of that time, but we're going to go into that. Another remarkable papyrus from the reign of Ramses III has a great deal of information on the structure and workings of the court, but from an unusual angle. Known as the Harem Conspiracy Papyrus, it exists in 3 portions, of which the largest section, the Judicial Papyrus, is in Turin, and concerns the trial of a group who plotted to murder the king. The chief defendant was one of Ramses' minor queens, Tia, who hoped to see her son, Pentuer, succeed to the throne. Her name seems to be correct, but that of the prince is a circumlocution, as are the names of a number of the other defendants. They have been given fictitious names such as Ramesses III hates him, to indicate how great was their crime. Fortunately for the king, the plot was discovered and the guilty arrested. Ramses III himself commissioned the persecution. However, since he is spoken of later in the papyrus as the great god, dead, he must have died during the course of the trial, although not necessarily from any effects of the plot. 14 officials were called to sit in judgment, including 7 royal butlers, a high office, treasury overseers, 2 army standards bearers, 2 scribes, and a herald. Interestingly, several of their names betray foreign origins. The commission was given full powers to call whatever evidence was necessary, and most unusually, power to deliver and carry out the verdict, even the death penalty, which was normally reserved to the king. The majority of the conspirators were all personally close to the king, especially officials in the harem, which indicates how dangerous the situation was. Evidence also emerged of a plot to incite a revolt outside the palace to coincide with the intended coup within. Over 40 people were implicated and were tried in groups. The record of Queen T's trial has not survived, but she would not have been allowed to live. 28 people, including major ringleaders, were condemned in the first persecution, almost certainly to death. The second persecution condemned 6 people who were forced to commit suicide within the court itself. In the third persecution, the four people involved, who included the misguided Prince Pentuer, were likewise condemned to suicide, although not immediately within the court, but presumably in their cells. The fourth prosecution throws a curious light on the whole case. The defendants were not conspirators, but 3 of the judges and 2 officers who were charged that after their appointment to the commission, they knowingly entertained several of the women conspirators, and a general named Pais. One of the judges was found to be innocent. The others were condemned to have their ears and nose amputated. Pepys, a butler who was one of the convicted judges, committed suicide before the sentence could be carried out. Ramses, as mentioned, seemed to have died before the verdicts were reached. He was buried in a large tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV11, which has an unusual plan by virtue of its having been taken over from an earlier excavation. It is also unusual among the royal tombs in having some secular scenes, of which the paintings of the 2 blind male Harpers are well known, although now sadly much damaged when compared to the early copies made by Sir John Gardner Wilkinson. The tomb is often referred to in the literature as the tomb of the Harpers, or as Bruce tomb, after its discoverer James Bruce in 1769. Okay, so now this this is what. Now I'm going to go into a couple things. Now this was a tremendous scandal that went on. This was a plot in the harem. There were some individuals in the harem, a lower queen, which was the mother of Pentuer. Pentuer was a son of Ramses III. He was a prince. Ramesses IV was the son of the chief queen, and there was a struggle between these 2 queens. Both of them wanted their sons to be on the throne, but the lesser queen, the mother of, Prince Pentuer, took things a little bit further and was involved in this harem plot, which Ramses III, my ancestor, was killed in. His throat was slit. But let's go further with this. As Ramses III's long reign of 31 years came to an end, so did the greatness of the Kemetan pharaohs. The exact relationship of the subsequent kings bearing the name Ramses is at times obscured. Certainly, Ramses IV, V, VI, and VIII appear to have been sons of Ramses III, although, as noted, many of his sons had died young, while Ramses VII seems to have been a son of Ramses VI. Okay, now we're going to talk about Ramses IV, but before we go to Ramses IV, and then we discuss Ramses V and VI, we're going, let me go in succession about the reigns of these Ramses. So we're going to talk about the next 3 pharaohs of part 1, which is Ramses IV. He reigned between 1151 to 1145 BC. Ramses V, he reigned 1145 to 1141 BC. And Ramses VI, he reigned 1141 to 1133 BC. Okay, so let's go into that. Into Ramesses IV. Ramesses IV succeeded to the throne in about 1151 BC. The identity of his mother, probably either Queen Isis or Queen Titi, is still uncertain, but we do know that he made Setnakte his chief wife. She lies buried in tomb 74 in the Valley of the Queens. The new king's first task was to bury his father in the Valley of the Kings within 4 days of the ceremony. As Astraka from the Workmen's Valley of Deir el-Medina record, the customary gifts had arrived there, and the workmen could look forward to a new commission to cut Ramses IV tomb. Several inscribed stills in the Wadi Hamanat record the activities of large expeditions sent by Ramses IV to obtain good stone for statues. One group of 8,368 men, including 2,000 soldiers, indicative of the amount of policing of the workforce required rather than any defense against attack. Expeditions to the turquoise mines at Serabit el-Qadim in Sinai were also recorded, and as far south in Nubia as the fort at Burhan, almost to the Second Cataract, despite all his endeavors. And good works for gods, and his prayer to Osiris, recorded on a still of year 4 at Abydos, that Thy shalt give me the great age with a long reign as my predecessor. Ramses IV reigned for only 6 years. The tomb of Ramses IV lies just outside the earlier main group in the eastern Valley of the Kings. It has brightly colored and detailed wall paintings. The large sarcophagus box and its lid, largely intact, still stand in the burial hall. As indicated by its low number KV2, the tomb has been open since antiquity. Coptic graffiti cover the walls near the entrance. Like its companion Ramses tombs, it is the unfinished but an interesting papyrus preserved in Turin gives its plan. A puzzling feature was the series of 4 narrow box-like lines the architect had drawn around the sarcophagus in the burial chamber, the House of God. The House of Gold, correction. Their meaning became abundantly clear when Tutankhamun burial chamber was opened in 1923 and the 4 great gold-covered wooden shrines enclosing his sarcophagus were revealed. The mummy of Ramses IV was found in the royal cache in Amenhotep II's tomb, KV 35, in 1898. Alright, so Ramses IV only reigned for 6 years, and his chief responsibility was to make sure that his father had a proper burial, and then he took on matters of the state. Now we're going to read about Ramses V and Ramses VI. There's not too much information on these 2 pharaohs. But we are going to read up about these two particular pharaohs. Okay, Ramesses V and Ramses VI. On the evidence of a fragmentary heretic papyrus in Turin, there appears to have been a civil war raging during Ramses V's short 4-year reign. Workmen stopped digging his tomb, KV9, in the valley as they were idle from fear of the enemy. And Ostrakhan records that the king was buried in year 2 of Ramses VI, which is curious since he should normally have been buried no more than 70 days into the new reign. Possibly Ramses V died during the reign of his brother Ramses VI. But does this therefore indicate that they ruled jointly, or more probably in light of the civil war, that Ramses V was usurped by his brother and held captive until his death? Ramses V's mummy was found in the tomb of Amenhotep II, KV 35. It has much larger than usual embalmers incisions on his left side for extracting the viscera lesions on the face, suggests that the king suffered from smallpox. Ramses VI enjoyed an 8-year reign, longer than either of his two brothers. It seems that during this time, Kemets' long-distance contacts and serenity over much of the Near East were drastically reduced. The turquoise mines in Sinai were abandoned, and the eastern frontier pulled back from Palestine to the edge of the eastern delta. Having usurped his predecessor's tomb in the valley, KV9, Ramses VI extended it considerably. It culminated in a large painted and vaulted burial hall. The grievously battered mummy of Ramses VI was found in KV 35, Amenhotep II, in 1898. Of all the royal mummies, it was the one most savagely attacked by the tomb robbers, the head and torso having been hacked to pieces with an axe. The priests had piously rewrapped the pieces on a board in an effort to make it resemble human form. When Elliot Smith examined it in 1905, he found portions of at least 2 other bodies included within the wrapping: a woman's right hand and the mutilated right hand and forearm of another man. Where the king's neck should have been were his separate left hip bone and part of his pelvis. The end of the 20th dynasty, with the last of the pharaohs bearing the name Ramses, is very obscure. These kings fall mainly into 2 groups: those related to Ramses III and those to Ramses VI. Despite the grandeur of the name, none of them had any ancestral connection with their great predecessor, Ramses II. Okay, so that's the end there, and like I mentioned many times before, I'm always curious. I mean, do these robbers have to go to that extent to mutilate the bodies of these great pharaohs? I mean, this is kind of kind of savage, to a certain degree. But that was what went on during the time. So there was a possible civil war between the two brothers, Ramesses V and Ramesses VI, and the lighter, which is Ramesses VI, won the war and basically usurped the throne. Now, in part 2 of the 20th dynasty, which would be on Monday, March 28th at 5 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Mountain Time, and 3 p.m. Pacific Time, we will discuss the last 5 pharaohs of the 20th dynasty. And those pharaohs are Ramses VII, Ramses VIII, Ramses IX, Ramses X, and Ramses XI. So we will talk about these last 5 pharaohs of the 20th dynasty. Once again, thank you for joining me here on the Royal House of Ra. Please remember to hit that like button to support the show, subscribe, and I am your host, Ramses Khufu El Ra. Thank you for tuning into the show. Have a blessed day, and God bless.